everyone. My name is Sarah Ali. Today, inshallah, I'll be finishing the course with you. Hopefully, you'll enjoy the class. Now, today we're going to speak about descriptions. I'm going to write a few questions on the board, and I'd like you to think of them. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think, okay? And then we'll discuss them together. Good? So the first question, I'd like you to think of description in general. What do we mean by description? What is it that we describe when we write stories? The second one, what kind of things or people do we describe? Do we describe people? Do we describe the heroes, the protagonists, the antagonists? Do we describe inanimate things, a table, a wall, a book? We're speaking about fiction now. We're not talking about a newspaper article. We're not talking about something that is real. We're talking about fiction, novels, short stories, poetry, etc. The third question, what is the point of it all? Why do we describe? Why do you think it's helpful to describe something in a short story? Why, let's say we're writing a story about this room, and then we start with this table, or with the laptop, and I start describing the thing. I start saying that the color is blah, 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 the space is taking blah, blah, blah. I give description to the thing. What's the point? Why should I do this? Why would I do this? And the last thing is we're going to speak about some examples, and then if we have some time left, we're going to take some examples from you. So it's going to turn into a workshop at the end, okay? So 2 minutes and then we'll talk together. Yes?
Yeah.
Any opinions? Yes.
Yes, what do we mean by description? I think description it's to give so much details about something like particular thing, and to show how it's its outside appearance, its look, its shape from the outside, and to show how it's smell and how do you feel toward that thing.
Good point. She said something about smelling. So what do we engage when we describe it? We engage our senses. We engage our sight, our smell, our noses, our ears. We try to engage our senses. We see things, we smell things, we hear things, we touch things, we taste things as well. Good. Someone else? Yes?
Because we see things differently, so I think a description is a way of telling you how I see this camera or this wall. So, because we are not objective about viewing the world, so I have to describe things always.
Good, well said. So, the way I see this camera is different from the way this young lady sees it. The way we see this room is quite different. I see it as a place to learn something. Maybe it doesn't mean a lot to me. Maybe you've been coming here for quite some time, so it means a lot more to you than it means to me. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to you. Maybe you've experienced something in here that makes it a lot more meaningful. So yes, we see things differently. When I describe something, it's not quite the same thing as if you describe it or if he describes it, etc. Yes?
A piece of writing that gives details or more details about something or someone I want to describe.
Good. So more details.
It focuses on showing, not telling.
Very good. In showing, not telling. Good. Can you give me an example of that?
And it means when I describe something, it helps us to imagine as a scene or something.
Okay,
like that.
good. If I'm writing a story of fiction about this room and this young lady here, and I start by saying, what's your name?
Nida.
Nida. Nida came into the spacious, beautiful room overlooking the beach, for example. I gave a vivid description of what the room is like. It overlooks the beach. It's beautiful, it's spacious, it's not close, it's not tiny. And then, instead of telling that Nida has a positive impression of the room, I simply described the room positively. Through this way, I gave the impression, I gave my reader the thought that maybe Nida actually likes the room. I did not say that she does, but I said that she came into the spacious, beautiful room overlooking the beach. I did not say that she likes it, but you get the hint that maybe she does. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Someone else? Guys over there? Would you like to add anything? Okay. So what kind of things or people do we describe? You know Charles Dickens, right?
Yeah.
A Victorian writer.
Yeah.
What kind of things does he describe in his novels?
Like Twist Oliver.
Okay.
Oliver Twist, sorry.
Yes.
When he describes the Oliver
Yes.
as a child, a little child.
Yes. He's very tiny.
Yes.
Good.
And when he describes the Fagin, Joe man.
Yes. The Jewish man.
The Jewish man, as the evil and the leader of the gang.
Good. Good. But this description, when I talk about description, our topic today, do I really mean bad and evil and good-hearted and kind-hearted and mean, and is that the kind of description I'm talking about? That's part of it, but it's not all. Can you add to things that he mentioned about Oliver? When I say that Oliver is kind-hearted, he's very brave. When I say that Fagin was a miser, he did not want to give away his money. What kind of description are we talking about? Yes.
I think the environment or the place where the characters are living.
Okay.
I think it's important. It contributes to the story.
Very good. So, are we talking about physical description?
Yeah.
Something that we can touch? Yes. Mostly yes. So when I'm talking about Charles Dickens, I don't merely mean the description of characters as flat or round. You know, round and flat characters. I'm not talking only about, is this the bad guy or the good guy in the story? I'm talking beyond that. I'm talking about, I don't care now if Oliver is the protagonist or not. I don't care if he's good or not. I don't care about his character as much as how he looks. So I would go into his hair, his eyes, his complexion, his skin, his height. That is the kind of description we're talking about today. That is the focus, okay? Rather than, we're not focusing on the character as being morally superior or as being good internally. We're talking more about how they look, how they feel, how they smell, okay? Good? Anything you would like to add? Okay, what's the point of it all? Why do we describe things? If you were to write a short story, and you were going to narrate the events, 1, 2, 3, etc., it makes sense, it gives the story. As a reader, I might enjoy it. Maybe sometimes you read novels in English, and there are 2, especially with Charles Dickens, you would read the novel, there are 2 pages of description. Mere description, no events. You would just go and go and go, and it's kind of, boring. So, why do we describe them? Why do most of the famous writers use description in their writing? What is the point? Yes?
So that the audience can enter the story, and another thing is that we can fathom things from the character's perspectives.
That's excellent. Good point. So, you've actually made 2 points. Number 1, it gives you a vivid impression of what you're reading. It's very clear. You can imagine it. So, if I talk about, we're going to discuss 2 examples in details, but before that, if I talk from telling you a story about a cottage in the forest, you know cottages, right? And I don't describe it. A cottage is a very small place to live in. It's like a shelter. So I go into talking about this story, about the cottage, without actually describing the cottage. I don't say if the cottage looked glim, or if it was really prim, or if it was really gloomy, or if it was really spacious and nice and good looking. I just go into telling the story. Now, what is the problem? Do you get the story at the end or not? Be honest. If I tell a story with no description, do you get the story? Most of the time, yes.
Yeah.
You get the plot. The plot is a series of events. I simply tell you the plot. So what does this description add? First, it makes the story vivid, very clear. I can imagine the cottage. So if I'm talking about Snow White, she lived in a cottage with 7 elves, or dwarfs, you know, the elves. Snow White, familiar with the story, right? She lived in the forest in a small cottage with 7 elves, or dwarfs. Now, if I don't describe the dwarfs, you're not going to get an impression of how they look like. And we know that in the story, the elves, plural elves, the 7 elves with whom she lived, they're not real creatures. They're invented. Unless, as a writer, unless I go and describe them and I say, the first elf was responsible for cooking. He looked very short and he was chubby. So you get the idea that he was a little bit fat, he was chubby. And then you're going to guess that maybe he was the cook in the cottage. Then I move to some other elf and I start describing him. And I say this was the intelligent elf. He had glasses on, which indicate most of the time, stereotypically speaking, they indicate what? Intelligence, glasses. So that was the intelligent, the smart guy among the elves. Then I move to someone else and I say he was...
Bodybuilding.
Yes, bodybuilding, strength, powerful. One of them was weightlifting in the cottage probably, although that would be a bit odd because that was long time ago. They wouldn't have had any weights to lift. But anyway, so do you get the idea? It makes it a lot more vivid. Now we get to know the elves. We get to know Snow White as well because she was a perfectly normal human being. She looked like us. She was white, she was a girl, she had black hair, red lips, etc. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So again, we're reading something and we can imagine it. Now, something else which, what's her name? Hannah. Which Hannah said is that we get a perspective, an opinion from one of the characters, not us. I'll give you an example. We'll start with the second example. Let's just start with this one because it relates more to the point she mentioned.
I want to add something.
Yes, right.
For the point of the description.
Yes.
I think it's important to make your story to be more realistic because the reader will be convinced when it looks more realistic than fiction.
Yes, good point, yes. So, would you say that most of Charles Dickens' stories were realistic.
Yeah.
Yes, he was a realist writer. He wrote in the Victorian age, like Jane Austen. They wrote about real stuff most of the time, about poverty, about the Industrial Revolution, about young children traveling, about labor, about marriage, about young women learning music, learning piano, etc. Good point. Yes.
Another point.
Yes.
I think description is important to justify the action of characters in the story. Because I don't want the reader to say why he did that or does or something like that.
Excellent, excellent. Sometimes, and this is something that is written in your papers somewhere, sometimes descriptions do not add to the story. They tell the story, they are the story. Again, sometimes descriptions do not add to the story. They tell the story, or they are the story. What's your name? Ibrahim. What Ibrahim just said, for example, if there's a crime in a story, let's imagine a crime series of stories, and there's a crime, there's a murder, let's say, someone is killed. You read about the story, and you're feeling some sympathy towards the antagonist, the guy who committed the murder, okay? But then you read about the protagonist, or the guy who's been killed, and you realize that he was very mean, let's say, very foxy, like a fox, quite mean. He was very intelligent, but he only used his intelligence for his own advantages, for his own benefits. And then you read some physical description, which also adds to the mental and spiritual and emotional description. And you read that maybe he was short, because in most stories, no offense to short people, but in most stories, short people are described as being mean. Tall people are described as being, most of the time, as a stereotype, stupid. Stupid. That is the stereotype. You know stereotypes. Stereotype, a typical image that is not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Got it? Okay. Good point. So sometimes descriptions. Now, if this character
Is
who
this in
is
the English literature?
what? Stereotypes?
Yeah.
Yes, they do exist. Yes.
No, I mean the short and tall.
Yes, it does. Yes. Yes.
Same
Yes.
as us.
Yes. Slightly different. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same, but with the short, yes. The short is always mean, a little bit smarter, but not smart in a good way. Smart in a negative way. Okay. So if this guy is killed, and after you read the description of his character, both physically, emotionally, etc., and then you kind of start to justify the murder. You start to feel sympathy towards the murderer. You're kind of, okay, well, he was a bad guy at the end. Maybe he had a reason to kill him. Now, the justification adds to the story itself. You're telling the story. This is the story. The description is the story. I'm not telling A, B, C. We know there's a murder. I come to the scene, and there's a crime scene, there's a body, there's a core, and there's a murderer. And then that's the only story. There's no sequence of events. You just came and there's a body, it's a crime scene. Now what follows, the description, it's like a flashback. You know the technique of flashback.
Yeah.
You go into the life of this dead guy and you realize, well, he was rubbish. And you're kind of like, well, maybe he deserved it. So in this sense, the description, it doesn't just add to the story, it is the story. Okay? Maybe the whole story is a moral justification for killing, for committing murder, that maybe we do have the right to kill people if we hate them, etc. Okay. Would you like to add anything before we go into the examples? Okay. Go to page 2, the second page. In the middle of the page, 2, for evidence in support of this claim. Now, go a little bit down. At the end of this paragraph, introduced first are the terpenes. Did you find it? Mm-hmm. Okay, can someone read, please? It's in the middle of the page, in the middle of the line. Introduced first are the terpenes. Okay.
Should I start?
Just a minute. Now, this is taken from, did you all find it? This is taken from a short story by an American writer, O'Connor. The story is called Revelation. And the scene with which the story starts is a description of a waiting room at the doctor's office. So there's a doctor, there's an office, and there's a waiting room. In the waiting room, there are people waiting, all right? Patients. One of those patients is Mrs. Turpin, about whom we're going to read now. So Mrs. Turpin is a patient in this office. She goes into the room, she sees people waiting for the doctor, waiting for their appointments, and she starts making judgments. Now we're going to see the description of Mrs. Turpin. She comes with her husband, and the writer, O'Connor, starts giving us descriptions, vivid descriptions of how this lady looks like, how she thinks like. Good. Yes.
Introduced first are the Turpins, Claude and his wife. Mrs. Turpin is described first. She's very large, and her bright black eyes taking in all the patients that she sized up the feeding situation.
Good. Can you tell me what part of speech is size in this sentence? What part of speech?
Verb.
It's a verb. How do you know? Size is up with an S, okay? So she comes into the room, and what does she do? She's very large. She's a large woman, tall, fat, huge. She comes into the room, she sizes up. It's like in Arabic when we say they looked from head to toe, like disparagingly, like in a really patronizing way, to look down to someone. So what did she do? She took a look at everyone in the room. She sized up. It's as if she understood everything that is going in the room. She had an impression of everyone, and she knew everything that is going on in the room. Clear? She's very large. What do we know about her appearance, other than that she is very large? Yes. What does that indicate? What do you think the writer means here? Do we just include details? You're going to write stories. You're studying creative writing because you want to write stories. Are we going to include description for the sake of description?
No.
Not necessarily.
There are connotations beyond every single description.
Yes, so if I say she had black eyes or white eyes or green eyes or whatever color, I mean something. If I said she had, yes?
It means symbolize something.
Okay, yes. So there's something beyond the description. If I'm talking about if the story is in an Arab society, a stereotypical Arab society where we cherish, where we glorify green and blue eyes, then if I'm writing a story about the Palestinian society, about Gaza, and the first thing you read about the heroine, the female hero, is that she had green eyes. What do I want to say? She's beautiful, she's pretty. If we're reading an American story, and the first thing I start describing is that the hero, the guy, had a brown complexion, a brown skin. What does that indicate? Beauty to them. Exotic, that he's exotic. You know exotic? Exotic is a word that refers to something that is different, that is remote, that is far away. You've heard of Orientalism and Edward Said. Now, what do they think of us? The West think the East is exotic, something that is strange, something that is new to you. That, for example, we're brown, we ride camels, that we don't have technology. To them, that is an exotic idea. Strange, something that is different and remote and far away from who you are. Clear? So, maybe brown indicates exotic. Yes, what do you want to say?
I want just to add something. In one of the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, there is an indication, blue eyes indicate death in a way.
Yeah.
So
That's
every single color has
yes,
special
that is
connotation.
true. Yes, that is true. But again, as creative writers, never stick to what is stereotypical. So the idea is to invent something. Maybe I will have a tall guy in my story who's incredibly intelligent. I want to challenge this stereotype. I want to defy this stereotype. Of course, there are connotations. There are things that automatically jump into your head as soon as you start reading something. As soon as you start reading, well, blue eyes, this guy is going to die, for example, or his wife is going to die, etc. But your job as a creative writer is to try to be as flexible as you want to be. Try to be as remote from stereotypes as you want to be, or as you can be. Sometimes you want to reinforce stereotypes. You want to say that green eyes, blue eyes are the prettiest. That's fine, if you have a point in mind. Okay, shall we move on? Go ahead. Already we can sense.
Already we can sense that Mrs. Turpin will be a major character, and indeed, we go on to see everyone and everything else in the waiting room through her bright black eyes.
Bright black eyes. So, can you tell me the significance now, the significance of the bright black eyes? They can see, they can capture everything. That is why they are black.
Yeah.
You know, in general, I don't know if it's been proven in science, but the darker the eye is, the better your sight is. That's what I heard. I'm not sure if it's scientifically true.
I think it's a myth.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, not in this case. In this case, I think they're meant to be dark in order to say that, you know, she could capture everything. She could grasp everything,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this paragraph that Nida is reading at the moment is the writer of this, okay? It's not O'Connor. She's explaining stuff. Yes, go ahead.
She sees that there is only one vacant chair, and this is important. A place on the sofa occupied by a blonde child in a dirty blue romper who should have been told to move over and make room for the lady.
Okay, excellent. Now I want you to read this sentence carefully from a place until for the lady. I want you to highlight or circle or underline any description that you find. Highlight descriptions. Yes? Yes? Okay. Yes, Nida. Hannah, sorry.
Now we know there is a sofa, a place on the sofa, occupied by a blonde child. We know that there is a blonde child, he's blonde.
Okay.
In a dirty blue romper, we know that there is a dirty blue, where the color is blue and it's dirty.
Okay.
Who should have been told to move over and make room for the lady. This is an opinion told by the narrator itself, which is the lady.
Okay.
She thinks that the child should have been told to move by the ladies sitting in the room in order to make her sit.
Okay. Well said. Someone else? Would you like to add anything? So we start with a physical description of the place. Now, generally speaking, and again, there shouldn't be rules in creative writing. So there's something in general that most writers do, most professional writers do, which is you describe the place and then you move on to the people, and not the other way around. Places and then people. Now, if you write a short story and you start with people and then places, should I say, no, this is wrong? Of course not. Again, this is the point of creative writing. But the common way of doing it is you describe the place and then you move on to any inanimate objects, a table, a chair, etc. And then you move on to the character. Okay? So a place on the sofa, we know that there's a sofa in the room, occupied by a blonde child, so we know that he's blonde. In a dirty blue romper. Romper is like a garment with one piece. Okay? Not jeans and t-shirt, it's one piece. A dirty blue romper. We know that the romper is blue. Not only blue, but it's also dirty. So we get the impression, and we get a lot of connotations about the child, who should have been told to move over and make room for the lady. This little boy, someone should have told him to move and make room for the lady. She's older, she's a patient probably. He should have made some space. So, if I ask you now, the last bit from who till lady. If I tell you this is clearly an opinion, like Hannah said, it's clearly an opinion, it's a perspective, it's a view. It's something that we can disagree on. How do you know that it's an opinion? Maybe I will say, no, maybe this little boy is a patient. Maybe he needs the chair more than she does. Okay? So this is an opinion. Now, if I ask you, is this the opinion of the author, the narrator, or the character? You know the differences? The author is all color. The narrator is a third person narrator. Why? Because we don't have I, first person, we don't have you, second person. We have she, he, they. So third person narrator. And we've got the character, who's Mrs. Turpin, the woman. Who do you think this is the opinion of? Whose opinion is it?
Mrs. Turpin.
Why, Hannah? If it's Mrs. Turpin, why do you think so?
Because she's standing there and she can see everything around, and she's telling things from her own perspective.
But she's not the narrator. If I ask you, is Mrs. Tabb the narrator? No.
No.
Is she the third person narrator? No. Because if she was, she would have said, I. We don't have I's. We have she's and he's and they's. Okay. I do agree. It is the opinion of the character. But why? How did you know that it's her opinion?
It can't be the opinion of the narrator. The narrator, it must be objective, and he must only describe things, and he can't insert his opinion.
Have you heard of the implied author? Implied author? Okay, yes.
If it was the narrator who said that, he wouldn't say that the little boy should move and take a room for the lady. This speech is for the lady, and if the narrator who said that, he will describe the situation neutrally just, I think.
Okay. Rahim.
Maybe she don't want to sit in the chair, Mr. Trupp.
Okay.
So I think it's not justified by the narrator to say his opinion.
Okay. Now, we know that Mrs. Turpin, I'm telling you that it's Mrs. Turpin, this is what she thinks. If I'm reading a story and I want to make judgments, we said that Mrs. Turpin is judgmental. So she sees this girl and she says, well, she doesn't study enough, she's not hardworking. She sees that guy and she says he should go to the gym. She says that woman, and she's very judgmental. She thinks she knows everything. She makes judgments on other people. Now, the moment we start describing things, we know that the narrator here, in this case, is very remote, is very far away from the scene. We've got a room, a waiting room in a doctor's office, and the narrator goes in and out of her mind, of the character's mind. He goes in, he goes out, he goes in, he goes out. We don't know, it's very hard to tell, is this his opinion or her opinion? As soon as we read dirty blue romper, we know that she's very judgmental. She, who is Mrs. Turpin, is very judgmental. Now, when we reach this part, we know that the narrator and the author, both, neither of them can say that this boy should move and make room for the lady. Who is it going to be? Mrs. Turpin. Because she's judgmental, because as soon as she came into the room, the first thing is she sized up everyone, she took a look at everyone, she understood everything, then she looked at the boy and she noticed that his clothes were dirty, she made instant judgments, and then she thought, well, you should have moved and made space for me. But we don't see any me in the paragraph, we don't see any I, we just understand it. So if I go back to the question of what is the point of description, what would you say now? In this paragraph, what is the point? We see things through her eyes, and this is something that Hannah mentioned. Now, it's not about making the room very clear to us as much as it is about making it us clear how Mrs. Turpin sees the room. She thinks that this boy is wearing dirty clothes, and she thinks that he should have moved and given her the chair. So, description not only adds things, not only makes the story vivid to you, it makes it vivid, it makes it clear how the characters in the story see the story. So now we know how the character inside the story sees the place. Okay? So maybe the narrator, the author could have said, this child was wearing a blue t-shirt or a blue romper which was dirty. He could have moved instead of should. He could have moved, but he did not. Now, he could have moved sounds more objective, sounds more neutral. It's said more neutrally when you say, well, he could have moved, but he did not. We know that it was an option, but he didn't pursue it. We know that it was an option and he just didn't do it. On the other hand, in this paragraph, we see that it was not an option, it was something that he was supposed to do, and we know that it's not the narrator's opinion, it's not the author's opinion, it's Mrs. Turpin. But again, she's not talking, she's not the narrator. So we have a narrator, an implied narrator, who's telling us this, but the perspective, the view, the opinion is that of Mrs. Tabb. Clear? Okay. Ron?
Got that? Not just a child or even a blonde child, but a blonde child in a dirty blue romper who, and this is the kicker, should have been told to move over and make room for the lady. That's interesting. Where are those details coming from? Who says that the child was dirty and should have been told to make room for Mrs. Turpin? The author? The implied author? The third person narrator? Of course not.
Who? Yes.
The bit about moving over and making room for the lady, that comes from Mrs. Turpin herself.
Yes. So it comes from one of the characters, and we get to feel what she feels. We get to know what she knows. Yes.
That's what she thinks, what she expects. She's the one who sees herself as a lady.
Very good. And lady here, do you think it's a patronizing description or is it a positive description? It's a positive one. She's a lady, a respectable lady. Unlike if I say a woman or a girl, it's less respectable than a lady. Mm-hmm. Yes.
All of these details are conveyed to us through the skillful use of a free indirect discourse, the technique we examined back in lecture 3.
Do you know free indirect discourse? What is free indirect discourse? Okay. When I don't say she said, he said, they said. When I don't say she thought, I did not say that Mrs. Turpin thought that the boy should have moved. I just said that there was a boy who should have moved, and automatically it was implied that this is Mrs. Turpin's opinion. We did not clearly state that she thought that. Do you see any she thought? No. Or she said? No. Did you do speech tags? speech
Yes,
tags?
yes.
Yes, okay. So we've got nothing about she said or she thought. We only have the opinion stated clearly, and we know that it's Mrs. Turpin. Free indirect discourse again, you don't have she said, he said, he thought to himself, etc. Yes.
As you will recall, a free indirect discourse allows a third-person narrator to move in and out of a character's mind without the use of a cumbersome tag like she thought or she said to herself. In this case, we are glad that O'Connor dispensed with those tags. If she had used them, she would have slowed the flow of the paragraph and destroyed much of its humor.
Okay. Now we're going to read 3 more descriptions from this story. Are you following the narrative, the flow of the story? Again, it's a doctor's office. It's a waiting room. There are people waiting for their appointments. There's a woman who goes into the room called Mrs. Turpin, and she starts automatically making judgments about the people in the room. Now you've got some examples, other examples. Someone else to read? You've got Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and Exhibit C. We're going to read them. Come on, someone to read. The line in bold, every other time. It's the same page, the second page. Every other time, the description betrays Mrs. Turpin. Yes, Brahim.
Every other time, the description betrays Mr. Turpin's feelings of social and moral superiority.
Okay, so we know now, this is of course, again, a bit of the pamphlet, it's not from the story. What are we told? We're told that she thinks that she's socially superior. And we're going to see why. You know, socially superior. She thinks she's better than everyone else. And this plays into the idea of class system, because the society is divided into upper class, middle class, and the working class or the lower class. And usually in English and American literature, when we say middle class is actually closer to the upper than to the lower. Okay? So when we say he was a middle class lawyer, let's say, it's a positive description usually, the bourgeois. So this middle class is closer to the upper class than it is to the lower or working class. Yes, go ahead.
Here is Exhibit A. A fat girl of 18 or 19 is scrolling into a book. Her complexion is blue with acne, and Mrs. Turpin thinks how pitiful it was to have a face like that at that age.
Good. This is a quotation from the actual story. You know, acne's on our faces sometimes. Acne's small red stuff on our faces. Acne. Especially when we are teenagers, we've got a lot of acne. So, this is a description of one of the people waiting in the room. So we've got Mrs. Turpin's judgment, the first judgment. What is it? A fat girl of 18 or 19. Now, we know from the very beginning that Mrs. Turpin is very
Judgmental.
okay, what else, physically speaking? Very old? Large. So, what do you think is the connection here? Description helps us make connections. Now, we know that whose opinion is this about the fat girl? It's Mrs. Turpin's opinion. And we know that Mrs. Turpin has problems with her weight. She's overweight, she's very large. So, as soon as she goes into the room, she notices that a girl 18 or 19 years old is fat. This is the first thing she notices. Again, what is the point of description? What does it help us do? It helps us make connections. Yes? So, a fat girl of 18 or 19, scowling into a book. Scowling, you know, scowl, frown. You know, when you look angrily, grump. So, she's scowling into a book. Her complexion is blue with acne. She's got so much acne on her face that her face looks what? Blue. Her face is full of acne, small dots. And Mrs. Turpin thinks, again, between quotations, this is from the story, how pitiful it was to have a face like that at that age. Now, we notice that she's making herself, Mrs. Turpin, making herself feel less bad about her weight, about the fact that she's very large, by saying, well, she has a bad skin, I don't. So, can you see the description? She's judging, she says she's fat, and she has acne on her face. Well, I'm very large, but I don't have acne on my face. Go on.
Mrs. Turpin sees a bit of herself in this girl. Both of them have problems with their weight, but she quickly takes comfort in the fact that she has always had good skin.
Yes, so she does speak about the good skin. Okay, B, go on. This is now another character in the story described by Mrs. Turpin. Yes.
Now for Exhibit B. A thin, leathery old woman in a cotton print dress.
Okay, you know print dresses, it's like, it's not a fancy dress. You know fancy, expensive dresses, it's not a fancy dress. So, as soon as we read this, we get the impression that Mrs. Turpin disapproves of this woman. A leathery woman, a thin, leathery old woman in a cotton print dress. The impression we get is also not really positive. A thin woman, an old woman. So if you're fat, you're judged by Mrs. Turpin. If you're thin, you're also judged by Mrs. Turpin. Exhibit C.
In addition to serving as another great example of a free indirect discourse, the little grammatical slip at the end of that sentence helps in excluding Mrs. Turpin's social pretension. Finally, Exhibit C. A lank-faced woman who was certainly the child's mother. She had on a yellow sweet shirt and wine-colored socks, both gritty looking. The narrator says, and the rims of her lips were stained with snuff.
Okay, what is a lank-faced? Lank-faced, thin. Lank-faced, thin, pale. A lank-faced woman who was certainly the child's mother. Now we get to know who the child's mother is. Now, we know that the child already made Mrs. Turpin uncomfortable, angry, and now she gets to know his mother. So, of course, she's not going to like his mother. She had on a yellow sweat shirt and wine-colored socks, both gritty looking. What is grit? Sand and stones. Sand and stones. Gritty, the adjective, gritty looking. It looks as if it's dusty, let's say. Because, you know, stones and sand, what do they cause? Dust. So it's not entirely clean, it's not tidy, it's not good looking. Now, what do you get from the description here? That she was wearing something yellow, the socks were wine colored, and can you see how subtle the description is? It's not like it looked like wine or it smelled like wine colored, like it had the color of wine. If I say sky colored beach, a beach that had the color of the sky, instead of saying it was blue, a very direct description, a bit dull, a bit boring, a bit cliche, I could say a sky colored beach, a wine colored blah blah blah. So a wine colored socks, both gritty looking. They look gritty, they're not clean. Those are what? The socks. The narrator says, and the rims of her lips were stained with stuff. You know a stain? If you have a stain on your clothes, a dot that, yes. So stained with what? Snuff. Now snuff here, I think it could refer to drugs. It doesn't necessarily refer to drugs, but the impression I got while reading is that because you know when drug addicts use or put drugs into their nose, and usually what gets dirty other than their nose? The lips. So her lips were stained with snuff. This is the woman. It could mean also, because she's a patient, a drug here is not necessarily cocaine. It can also mean a drug as medicine. Alright? So we're made to interpret, to guess what snuff here is. Okay? If I ask you now, what do these descriptions descriptions do? A, there's a fat girl, 18, 19, a teenager. She's got acne, and we know that this is probably Mrs. Turpin's opinion. Then she moves on to an old woman. She's wearing a printed dress. It's not a proper dress. The third description is the thin woman, the mother of the child. Her socks are what? Gritty looking, they're not very clean. And she's got what? Her lips are not clean either. She's got snuff on her lips. So all of these contribute to the idea that Mrs. Turpin is so judgmental. She judged people based on their appearances. She thought she knew everything she needs to know about those people in the waiting room. Right? Okay. We're going to be a little bit surprised at the end of the story. I want you to move down a little bit. Fair enough, at the end of the page. Fair enough, but what is the controlling it? Did you find it?
Yeah.
I think my page is different. Fair enough. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, Brahim.
Fair enough. But what is the controlling purpose in this particular story? What's the point of the description and revelation? My sense is that O'Connor is using all of these details in a couple of ways. First, she wants us to see what Miss Turpin is like. What Mrs. Turpin is like. Then, and this is a new point, she wants to trick us into behaving like Mrs. Turpin to trick us into being as dismissive and judgmental as this character can be. Only if O'Connor succeeds in playing that trick, only if she lures us into that trap, can she convince us that the story is something more than a comical look at a fat, foolish lady.
Good. So what do we get from this? Can you get the second point? So the first point is vivid description. It's what she thinks of other people. She's very judgmental. And then the other point of description is that we, as readers, are being deceived into doing exactly the same thing, into making the same mistake. How come? What have I been saying? That she's very judgmental, that she's large, that she's making judgments. So as readers, we're making the same mistake one of the characters is making. And this is one point of description. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I mean, there is a question here that we always ask ourselves: that should we trust the narrator? We don't know if she tells things as they really are.
Yes,
so
of
that
course.
we can be judgmental as well.
Yes.
So we can't judge things. We can't judge them perfectly. And
Yes. Yes. Good point. Yes. Do you think the 18 or 19-year-old girl is fat, or do you think Mrs. Turpin is over-describing it? Do you think she's exaggerating? Do you think the girl maybe is chubby, not necessarily fat? Do you think the boy is wearing clothes that are not very clean, not perfectly clean, but they're okay? Maybe he's got a stain on the sleeve or something.
He is a kid.
Okay.
He is a kid. So we must make his clothes dirty.
Okay, now you're finding justifications. You're becoming less judgmental than she is. Good. Okay, do you think they're true? Do you think they're necessarily true? Did she stick to what really was there? There's no right and wrong here. We're just chatting. We're guessing as readers. Okay. Someone else to read the last bit of the same story? It's It's the same page. Okay, shall we go on now at first? Just complete because there's something I would like you to read. Someone else, someone who hasn't read, come on. Now at first. Yes? Yeah?
Well,
Yeah?
well, now at first?
Yes.
Now at first, this may not make much sense. In many ways, after all, we are not like Mrs. Tabb. We are intelligent, educated people, eager to master the art of reading. Why, she is the wife of a hog farmer.
Yes. What is a hog farmer? A pig farmer. He's got pigs. Yes. Yeah.
Her grammar is often
Atrocious.
We have seen it for ourselves. And what is more, she relieves herself to be racist and snob.
Good. So she is a racist and a snob. Snob, if you're a snob, you think you're better than everyone else. You're arrogant. You're smug. You're full of yourself. Racist, you know racist. Okay. Yes. We're going to know why racist. Yes, go on.
When you get right down to it, she is the trashy one. So how could anyone possibly think that she is at all like you and me?
Yes, now we started saying, well, why does she think that black people are less than she is? And we're going to see that she's even racist towards other white people. Now, we are trying to put her down. We are judging her. Go on. Now do you see?
Now do you see what I mean? We put her down, assume that she is beneath us, and that's exactly what she does with almost everyone person in the story. So the story is not only about her, it's not about us. If she is the target of satire, then so many friends are we.
Yes, go on.
Now details.
Skip this paragraph. So what happens in the rest of the story?
So what happened in the rest of the story once the cast has been assembled in the little waiting room? How does Okra set the plot in the motion?
Yes. What happens? Have you read this story before? Okay. What happens in the story? One of the people in the waiting room attacks her verbally. So they call her names. What do they call her? A warthog from hell. Can you see it? It's between quotations. So what happens in the rest of the story, once the cast has been assembled in that little waiting room, how does O'Connor set the plot in motion? Well, if you must know, she has that fat girl, the one with the blue acne, attack Mrs. Turpin and call her a warthog from hell. That's right, a warthog from hell. Hog is a pig. So the attack is very close to the job, the occupation of whom? Her husband. We said that Mrs. Turpin is the wife of a hog farmer. He feeds, he breeds pigs. So she attacks her in the same way, something that relates to her husband's job. Yes? Has Mrs. Turpin done anything to provoke this assault? Well, yeah, sort of, she has. She's been going on, making casually racist remarks and indicating her contempt for everyone else in the room. So although the attack is not justified, it is understandable. Believe it or not, it makes a big impression on Mrs. Turpin, who in many ways takes it to heart. I can't be a warthog from hell, she says. Or can I? It's exactly as if you are in a room and I suddenly attack one of you and I say, you're really foolish. And you say, I'm not foolish. Or am I? You start to question yourself. This is what happens. So she says, I'm not blah blah. Am I blah blah blah? And then she says, oh, well, maybe I am. Am I? So we see a moment of Mrs. Turpin being vulnerable, being weak, okay? Questioning herself. the word hog hits very close to home since, as I mentioned earlier, her husband is a pig farmer. Okay, I'll go a little bit down. Can you see the paragraph in bold? The backdrop of the vision. Can you see it?
Yeah.
I'm going to read this. Now, this is at the end of the story. She gets a vision. She's imagining something, Mrs. Turpin. She's in the room, but she's imagining something. She's having a vision. The backdrop for the vision is beautiful, and so are the words used to describe it. Now, this is the description. The sun is setting, the narrator says, and there's a purple streak in the sky. So there's sunset, and there's a purple line, a purple streak in the sky. Again, physical description. Engaging what? Senses. Engaging the eyes in this example. On this purple streak, Mrs. Turpin sees a vast horde of souls rumbling toward heaven. Now, if you read the story, you know that Mrs. Turpin thinks that she's a good Christian, charitable woman. She gives to charity, she's respectable, she's a lady, she's Christian, she's a good woman overall. Now, in this example, in the vision she has, we see that she's got a vision of a horde of people, a group of people who are rumbling towards heaven. They're going towards heaven. As a respectable Christian, charitable woman, she thinks she's going to heaven. Who does she see among this horde, group, crowd of people going to heaven? All the people she has been describing. Again, so she's been describing people in the room. At the end of the story, this is the revelation, she's sitting, she's absent-minded, she's looking in the room, and she's got a vision. There's a procession, there's a group of people walking towards heaven. At the front of those people come who? The people she's been judging. The girl, the white trash, the black niggers we're going to read about now. At the end, at the rear, at the back of the procession come people like her, her husband, other people. People she thinks are more respectable. People she thinks are more deserving of respect and gratitude. Clear? Okay. So, the paragraph in the middle, the small quotation, there were whole companies of white trash. What is white trash? Now, we spoke about classes. In America, people who live in the South generally are less privileged than people who live in the North. So white trash refers to poor white people, people of socially lower class. Okay? What does that indicate? She's not poor, this is the first thing, and she does not come from a socially lower class. We automatically assume that if she's judging other people who come from a certain social background, if she's judging them, then we assume that she's not like them. She's a little bit more superior, above them. The whole companies of white trash clean for the first time in their lives. We see that even now, when she realizes, when she has this vision, she's still very judgmental. They're clean for the first time in their lives. So she knows that maybe they're better to God than I am. Maybe they're closer to God than I am. But she's still internally, she's still judging them. She says, well, they're clean for the first time in their lives. And bands of black niggers in white robes. Of course, you know that the word nigger is very racist. Yes, we're not allowed to say, but
yes,
it's here for a purpose. It's meant to be offensive. And battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. You know frogs. Freaks and lunatics, crazy people, people who are mentally ill. Now, all of those people who she thought that, you know, they were less than her, they were inferior to her, are now at the beginning, at the front of the procession. They're going to heaven before she is going to heaven. Now, move on to the next paragraph, bringing up the rear of the procession. Can you see it?
Yes.
Bringing up the rear of the procession, this is the back of the procession, was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. Their virtues, whatever good that they've done, is fading, is going into ashes. It's not really there. They're coming at the end of the procession for whatever reason. We don't know. The end is very open, okay? But we get a glimpse of the fact that maybe she's not as good as she thinks she is. Maybe those people she's been judging throughout the story are not as bad as she thinks they are, okay? So, description. We get to know other people through description. We get to know how Mrs. Turpin sees other people, how one of the characters sees the other characters through her eyes. We get to see what she sees. She sees that he's dirty, she sees that the girl is fat, she sees that the boy should have moved, and through that perspective, we as well see that kind of opinion, that kind of perspective, that kind of image. All right? Okay. Shall we take a break? 5 minutes?